It was 0545 on January 14th, 1943. The temperature on the outskirts of Stalingrad had dropped to minus 25 degrees Celsius. Senior Sergeant Ivan Korolenko lay prone in a frozen foxhole overlooking the ruined railyards of the Red October factory. He was 24 years old, a former carpenter from Siberia, now a sniper with the 62nd Army. His breath misted in the air, instantly freezing on the woolen scarf wrapped around his face. In his hands, he held a Mosin-Nagant 91/30 sniper rifle, modified with a 3.5 power PU scope. The weapon was a legend of the Eastern Front, chambered for the 7.62 x5 4mm cartridge, capable of killing a man at 800 meters. But at this temperature, the oil in the bolt action could freeze, turning a precision instrument into a useless metal club. Korolenko cycled the bolt every 10 minutes just to keep it functional. His unit, a depleted platoon of the 13th Guards Rifle Division, was holding the left flank of the factory. Intelligence reports indicated that a German mechanized infantry unit, supported by Panzer IV tanks, was preparing for a final push to break the Soviet lines before the winter encirclement fully tightened. Korolenko's job was simple: eliminate the officers, blind the tanks by shooting their periscopes, and buy time. Then, at 0600, the ground began to tremble. It wasn't the wind, it was the distinct, grinding mechanical roar of Maybach engines. Through his scope, Korolenko saw them emerging from the mist-gray shapes, moving against the white snow. Panzergrenadiers, elite German infantry. They were advancing in a wedge formation, using the tanks as mobile cover. The math of the battlefield was brutal. Korolenko had 5 rounds in his internal magazine. There were approximately 200 infantrymen advancing toward his position. His platoon had 1 Degtyaryov light machine gun and a handful of anti-tank grenades. They were outnumbered 10-1. The order from headquarters was, "Not one step back." 5 minutes later, the German artillery barrage began. It wasn't a creeping barrage, it was a targeted suppression strike. 88mm high-explosive shells slammed into the Soviet trench line. The earth erupted. Shrapnel, frozen dirt, and jagged metal tore through the air. Korolenko ducked low, clutching his rifle to his chest. The noise was deafening, a physical pressure that squeezed the lungs. A mortar shell landed 5 meters to his right. The shockwave threw him against the back wall of the foxhole. Dirt buried him. When he shook the debris off his helmet and looked at his weapon, his heart stopped. A piece of shrapnel had sheared through the wooden stock of the Mosin-Nagant and shattered the PU scope glass. The receiver was bent. The firing mechanism was jammed with mud and ice. His primary weapon was dead. The German infantry was 300 meters away and closing. He reached for his sidearm, a Tokarev TT-33 pistol, but realized the holster had been torn away during the explosion. He was a sniper without a gun, alone in a forward position, with the entire weight of a German assault bearing down on him. But Ivan Korolenko was a Soviet soldier, and Soviet soldiers carried a tool that was often more feared than a bayonet. Hanging from his belt was the MPL-50 entrenching tool, a small spade, 50 centimeters long. To a civilian, it was a shovel for digging latrines. To a veteran of the Eastern Front, it was a close-quarters axe. Korolenko had spent hours sharpening the steel edges of the blade until they could slice through paper. As the artillery lifted at 0615, the German infantry rose and began their charge, bayonets fixed, confident that the artillery had silenced the Russian positions. Korolenko looked at his broken rifle, then at the shovel. He unhooked the MPL-50 from his belt. The wooden handle felt solid in his grip. He checked the edge. It was razor sharp. He wasn't going to retreat. If they wanted this foxhole, they would have to come down into the mud to take it. The silence following the artillery barrage was deceptive. It was the deep, ringing silence of stunned eardrums and pulverized earth. Even Korolenko pressed his back against the frozen mud of the trench wall, gripping the handle of his MPL-50 shovel until his knuckles turned white. He could hear them now. The crunch of jackboots on snow, the metallic rattle of equipment. They were close, perhaps 10 meters away, moving with the confidence of men who believed they were walking over corpses. The German doctrine for clearing trenches was precise. Throw a steel hand granite, wait for the detonation, then jump in with submachine guns spraying. but the artillery had churned the earth so badly that the trench lines were unrecognizable, confusing the attackers. They hesitated. That hesitation bought Korolenko 2 seconds. A shadow fell across the lip of his foxhole. A German soldier, a Gefreiter from the insignia on his collar, peered over the edge, his Mauser Kar 9 8K rifle leading the way. The rifle was nearly 1.2 meters long, with its bayonet attached a clumsy spear in the confined space of a collapsed trench. Before the German could align the weapon, Korolenko lunged upward. He didn't swing the shovel like a digging tool. He chopped with it, using the sharpened steel edge like a hatchet. The blade struck the German in the neck, just above the collarbone. The impact was wet and dull. The soldier dropped without a scream, his rifle clattering uselessly against the frozen ground. Korolenko yanked the tool free and dragged the body down into the hole, using it as a sandbag. He didn't have time to process the kill. The second soldier was already there. This one was an Unteroffizier, armed with an MP-40 submachine gun. He saw his comrade fall and instinctively pulled the trigger. The 9mm rounds chewed up the lip of the trench, spraying frozen dirt into Korolenko's face. The German panicked. Instead of tossing a grenade, he jumped into the pit to finish the job, assuming the Soviet was wounded. It was a fatal miscalculation. In the tight confines of the foxhole, the MP-40 was useless if the barrel couldn't be brought to bear. Korolenko stepped inside the German's guard, jamming his left shoulder into the man's chest to pin the weapon against the trench wall. With his right hand, he brought the shovel edge down in a short, vicious arc. It wasn't elegant, it was butchery, but it was effective. Now, Korolenko had a choice. He could pick up the MP-40. It was a superior weapon, firing 500 rounds per minute. But the magazine was empty, and he didn't know where the spare pouches were, on the dead man's webbing. Fumbling for ammunition in the dark with numb fingers would take 10 seconds. He didn't have 10 seconds. He could hear shouting in German directly above him. The rest of the squad had realized something was wrong. He grabbed 2 potato masher grenades from the dead Unteroffizier's belt, primed one, and tossed it over the lip of the trench. He didn't wait for the explosion. He gripped his shovel, vaulted out of the foxhole, and ran into the smoke. He was no longer defending a position. He was hunting. The grenade detonation behind him was a dull thump that vibrated through the frozen ground, showering the trench with clumps of ice and dirt. Even Korolenko didn't look back. In the chaotic labyrinth of the Stalingrad trenches, hesitating meant dying. He moved low, his body scraping against the icy walls of the communication trench. The smoke from the explosion hung heavy in the freezing air, a gray curtain that reduced visibility to less than 5 meters. This was his element now. Long-range optics and ballistics tables no longer mattered. This was a knife fight in a phone booth. He rounded a sharp corner and nearly collided with a German machine gun team. 3 men. They were struggling to set up an MG-34 on a tripod, the 7.92mm barrel pointing towards the main Soviet defensive line. They were shouting at each other, frustrated by the debris and the cold. They were focused on the target ahead, assuming their flank was secure. They never saw him coming. Korolenko didn't scream. He didn't waste breath on a war cry. He stepped into the group with the silent, terrifying purpose of an executioner. The gunner was on his knees, adjusting the tripod. Korolenko swung the MPL-50 downward. The sharpened steel blade bit through the heavy wool of the gunner's greatcoat and deep into the shoulder muscle. The man collapsed, dragging the heavy machine gun down with him, the tripod legs sprawling uselessly in the mud. The loader turned, eyes wide with shock. He reached for the Luger pistol at his belt, fumbling with the frozen leather flap. The distance was too short. Korolenko used the momentum of his first strike to pivot, driving the flat of the shovel into the loader's face with the force of a sledgehammer. Bone shattered. The German reeled back, blinded by pain and blood, falling onto the ammunition boxes. The third soldier, the ammunition carrier, lunged forward with a trench knife. It was a clumsy attack, born of panic. Korolenko sidestepped, the adrenaline flooding his system, making time seem to slow down. He parried the knife arm with the wooden handle of the shovel, the wood chipping under the steel, then drove the sharpened edge into the soldier's midsection. The man folded. In 6 seconds, a machine gun team that could have suppressed an entire Soviet platoon had been neutralized by one man with a digging tool. Korolenko stood over the bodies, his chest heaving, steam rising from his uniform. The cold air burned his lungs. He looked at the MG-34. It was fully operational, a belt of ammunition ready to feed. But firing it would reveal his position instantly. Every German rifle in the sector would turn towards the muzzle flash. He wasn't a machine gunner, he was a ghost. He grabbed 2 more stick grenades and a pouch of ammunition from the dead loader. He left the machine gun in the mud and pushed deeper into the German lines. He wasn't retreating to safety, he was advancing into the teeth of the assault. The German infantry supporting the panzer tanks were relying on these trenches being clear. They assumed the artillery had done its work. They were wrong. Korolenko was now behind the first wave, a saboteur in their midst. As he moved, he could hear the grinding tracks of the Panzer IVs getting louder. They were breaking through. He had to stop the infantry protecting them, or the factory would fall. Ivan Korolenko was now operating in the most dangerous place on the Eastern Front. The blind spot between a German tank and its infantry screen. A Panzer IV Ausf. G had ground to a halt 20 meters ahead of him, its 75mm main gun traversing slowly to target a Soviet strongpoint in the ruined administrative building. The tank was a terrifying machine, but in the urban ruins of Stalingrad, it was vulnerable. It was deaf and partially blind. It relied entirely on the squad of infantry, huddled behind its rear hull, for protection against suicide bombers and anti-tank dogs. Korolenko watched from the shadows of a collapsed brick wall. There were 8 soldiers behind the tank. Standing in the center was an Oberleutnant, a senior lieutenant shouting instructions into a field radio handset, coordinating the assault with the armor. This officer was the brain. The tank was just the muscle. If Korolenko could kill the brain, the muscle would spasm and fail. The noise of the Panzer's Maybach engine was deafening, a constant mechanical scream that masked the sound of Korolenko's boots as he slipped into a shell crater just 5 meters from the German group. The smoke from the burning factory provided the perfect shroud. He gripped the handle of his MPL-50 shovel. His hands were numb, but his mind was crystal clear. He calculated the distance. 3 seconds to close the gap, 2 seconds to strike. He waited for the tank's main gun to fire. The moment the 75mm cannon erupted, sending a shockwave of dust and noise washing over the area, Korolenko launched himself from the crater. He didn't look like a soldier anymore. He looked like a creature born of the ruins, covered in mud, blood, and ice. He hit the German line from the rear right flank. The first soldier he reached was the radio operator standing next to the officer. Korolenko didn't hesitate. He drove the shovel edge into the base of the man's skull. The radio operator crumpled without a sound, the handset dangling from his wire. The Oberleutnant turned, sensing the movement. He saw a figure rising from the smoke, not holding a submachine gun, but raising a bloody digging tool. Before the officer could draw his Walther P-38, Korolenko struck. The blade caught the officer across the collarbone, severing the strap of his map case and biting deep into the chest cavity. The officer fell back against the hot exhaust vents of the Panzer, screaming a warning that was lost in the engine roar. The remaining 6 infantrymen spun around, panic flaring in their eyes. They expected to see a Soviet squad. Instead, they saw one man, moving with the frenzied violence of a demon. Korolenko didn't stop to duel. He pulled the pins on the 2 stick grenades he had scavenged earlier and dropped them at the feet of the clustered soldiers. He didn't run away. He dove underneath the rear overhang of the Panzer IV, rolling between the massive steel tracks. It was a suicidal maneuver, but it was the only cover available. The grenades detonated 3 seconds later. The blast was contained by the bodies of the German infantry and the hull of the tank. Shrapnel pinged off the underbelly armor just inches above Korolenko's head. The infantry screen had been shredded. The brain was dead. And now, the tank was alone. The world underneath the Panzer IV was a claustrophobic hell of dripping oil and radiating heat. Ivan Korolenko lay pressed against the frozen earth between the massive steel tracks, the vibrations of the 300-horsepower Maybach engine rattling his teeth. Above him, the tank crew was reacting to the explosions that had just wiped out their infantry support. They didn't know what had happened. They only knew they were suddenly alone. The tank lurched forward, the tracks grinding into the ice just inches from Korolenko's boots. If he stayed there, he would be crushed when the vehicle turned. If he ran, he would be cut down by the tank's hull machine gun or the supporting German units advancing from the rear. He chose the third option, the one no manual in the Red Army or the Wehrmacht accounted for. He climbed the tank. He scrambled up the rear armor plate, using the exhaust muffler as a foothold, the heat searing through his gloves. He hauled himself onto the engine deck just as the turret began to traverse. The tank was hunting for a target it couldn't see. Inside the steel beast, the visibility was already poor, limited to narrow vision blocks and the gunner's sight. Korolenko knew that a tank without infantry eyes was not a predator. It was prey. He moved to the turret, keeping low to avoid being spotted by other German units in the distance. He wasn't carrying anti-tank mines. He didn't have a Molotov cocktail. He had his shovel, the MPL-50. He crawled towards the commander's cupola, the raised drum on top of the turret, with 5 glass vision slits that allowed the commander to see 360 degrees. Korolenko raised the shovel and brought the steel edge down with all his strength onto the thick armored glass of the forward vision block. The impact didn't shatter the glass completely. It was bulletproof, but it starred the surface into a spiderweb of opaque white cracks. He swung again, and again. The glass shattered, not breaking through, but becoming completely useless. He moved around the cupola, methodical and savage, smashing every vision port. Inside the tank, the commander was now blind. The world outside had disappeared, replaced by the terrifying sound of metal striking metal directly above his head. The psychological effect was immediate. The crew began to panic. They shouted at each other, the tank spinning in place, its tracks churning the mud as the driver tried to back away from a threat he couldn't locate. Korolenko lay flat on the turret roof, gripping the ventilation cover, riding the spinning machine like a bronco. He knew what would happen next. It was human nature. When a man is blinded and trapped in a steel box, his instinct is to open the door. The commander's hatch cracked open, just a few inches. The German officer wanted to peek out, to see what was hammering on his tank, to regain situational awareness. It was the mistake Korolenko had been waiting for. He jammed the blade of the shovel into the gap, preventing the hatch from closing, and then he levered it open with a roar of exertion. The German commander looked up, expecting to see the sky. Instead, he saw the mud-streaked face of Ivan Korolenko. Before the officer could reach for his sidearm, Korolenko didn't use the blade. He punched the officer in the face with the heavy wooden handle, knocking him back down into the turret. Then, Korolenko pulled the pin on his last grenade and dropped it into the open hatch. He rolled off the side of the tank, hitting the snow and covering his head. The explosion inside the Panzer IV was muffled, a dull whump that vented smoke and pressure through the open hatch. The engine sputtered and died. The beast was dead. Korolenko lay in the snow for a moment, listening. The railyard was silent again. He had stopped a tank with a shovel and 3 grenades. But the war wasn't over. He picked up his tool and looked north. More engines were starting up. Ivan Korolenko lay in the bloodied snow beside the burning carcass of the Panzer IV. The heat radiating from the dying metal beast was the only thing keeping his extremities from frostbite. He was deafened, bruised, and exhausted, but the adrenaline coursing through his veins was a potent drug. He checked his body for wounds. Shrapnel had torn his tunic, but the heavy winter wool and the layers of dirt had saved his skin. He was alive. But he was still a sniper without a rifle. The MPL-50 shovel, now stained dark with frozen blood, went back into his belt loop. It had served its purpose, but he couldn't fight a mechanized battalion with a piece of sharpened steel alone. He needed firepower. He crawled back to the cluster of German infantry he had shredded with the grenades. It was a gruesome salvage operation. He found what he needed on the body of the dead Oberleutnant, an MP-40 submachine gun. It was undamaged. Korolenko checked the magazine. It was full 32 rounds of 9mm parabellum. He patted down the corpse and found a canvas pouch with 3 spare magazines. He also took the officer's Walther P-38 pistol and a pair of Zeiss binoculars. In 2 minutes, he had upgraded from a medieval warrior to a modern shock trooper. The sound of engines grew louder. Through the thick black smoke billowing from the Panzer, Korolenko saw the distinct, angular silhouette of an SD KFZ, 251 half-track, a Hanomag emerging from the mist. It was moving cautiously, its MG-42 machine gun traversing back and forth. This was the support vehicle coming to investigate why their lead tank had gone silent. Korolenko knew he couldn't penetrate the half-track's armor with a submachine gun. He had to be smarter. He had to play dead. He dragged himself into the deep furrow made by the tank's tracks, pulling a dead German soldier on top of him as a grisly shield. He buried his face in the snow, leaving only one eye exposed, watching through the crook of the dead man's arm. The half-track ground to a halt, 10 meters away. The engine idled, a low, throaty rumble. German voices called out. No answer. The rear doors of the Hanomag swung open, and 6 Panzergrenadiers dismounted, their boots crunching on the ice. They moved towards the burning tank, weapons raised, expecting to find a Soviet anti-tank gun crew or a minefield. They weren't looking for a lone survivor hiding under their own dead. They moved past Korolenko's position, their attention fixed on the open hatch of the tank. The MG-42 gunner remained in the vehicle, scanning the horizon, ignoring the ground immediately around him. This was the fatal flaw of the elite: arrogance. They assumed the threat was out there, not right beneath their feet. Korolenko waited until the 6 dismounted soldiers had their backs to him. He slowly pushed the dead body off his chest and raised the MP-40. He didn't aim for the soldiers first. He aimed for the gunner in the half-track. It was a difficult shot, upward at a sharp angle. He squeezed the trigger, a 3-round burst. The gunner slumped forward over his shield. The sound of the MP-40, a German weapon, confused the infantry on the ground. For a split second they hesitated, thinking it was friendly fire. That second was all Korolenko needed. He rolled onto his knees and unleashed a long, sweeping burst at the exposed squad. The 9mm rounds, fired at a cyclic rate of 500 rounds per minute, cut them down before they could turn around. The silence returned, heavier than before. Korolenko stood up, changing the magazine on his stolen weapon. He walked over to the half-track. The engine was still running. He climbed into the rear compartment. It was filled with crates. He pried one open with his shovel. It wasn't food. It wasn't blankets. It was Tellermine's heavy anti-tank explosives. A wolfish grin cracked Korolenko's frozen lips. He had just captured an armory. Ivan Korolenko sat in the driver's seat of the captured SD, KFZ 251, his hands gripping the large steering wheel. The controls were alien, labeled in German, but the mechanics of war were universal. He revved the engine, the half-track lurching forward through the snow. He wasn't fleeing the battlefield, he was repositioning the kill zone. 200 meters north of his position, the road to the Red October factory passed through a narrow railway underpass. It was a strategic choke point. If the German reinforcements, a column of supply trucks and self-propelled guns, made it through that tunnel, they would overrun the Soviet rear guard. Korolenko had to seal it. He drove the German vehicle straight toward the underpass. The irony wasn't lost on him. To any distant observer, he looked like a retreating German unit. He reached the tunnel entrance and swung the heavy vehicle sideways, blocking 2/3 of the road. It wasn't a perfect barricade, but it would force any approaching driver to slow down and navigate the gap. And that gap was where the trap would be. Korolenko leaped out of the rear compartment, dragging the crate of Tellermines with him. These were teamy 42 seconds, saucer-shaped discs of death packed with 5.5 kilograms of TNT. They were designed to shear the tracks off a tank or vaporize a truck. He worked with frantic precision. He placed the first mine in the center of the gap he had left open. He covered it with a thin layer of dirty snow and a discarded German tunic. He placed 2 more mines in the shadows of the tunnel walls, daisy-chaining them with a tripwire he fashioned from the half-track's tow cable. It was a crude setup, improvised in freezing darkness, but it didn't need to be pretty. It just needed to be invisible. He had just finished concealing the 3rd mine when the ground began to vibrate again. The reinforcements were here. Through the gloom, headlights cut through the falling snow. A Stooge 3 assault gun led the column, its low profile and 75mm cannon making it a deadly adversary. Behind it were 3 Opel Blitz trucks packed with infantry and ammunition. Korolenko didn't run. He climbed back into the captured half-track, but not into the driver's seat. He manned the rear MG-42 machine gun. He crouched low behind the gun shield, holding his breath. He was gambling everything on a single psychological assumption, that the Germans would hesitate before firing on one of their own vehicles. The Stug 3 approached the blockade, slowing down as the commander saw the half-track blocking the path. The German commander popped his hatch, shouting something angry into the cold air, assuming a breakdown or incompetence. The assault gun crawled forward, its tracks clanking on the cobblestones, inching toward the gap directly over the first teller mine. Korolenko watched the tracks. He needed the center of gravity to be over the mine for maximum effect. Wait. The Stooge dipped slightly as it hit a pothole. Now, the explosion was tectonic. The teller mine detonated directly under the Stug's thin belly armor. The 24-ton vehicle was lifted into the air like a toy, slammed back down, and instantly engulfed in flames. The ammunition inside cooked off, blowing the casemate roof sky high. The tunnel was blocked. The trap was sprung. But now, Korolenko was trapped in the kill box with 3 trucks full of angry infantry. The burning carcass of the Stug 3 assault gun acted like a cork in a bottle, but the pressure behind it was building fast. The 3 Opel Blitz trucks screeched to a halt, the drivers fighting the icy road to avoid colliding with the wreckage. Inside the canvas-covered beds, panic mixed with discipline. NCOs shouted orders, kicking tailgates open. 60 German soldiers, a full reinforced platoon, began to pour out onto the road. They were entering a slaughterhouse. Ivan Korolenko didn't wait for them to form a firing line. He racked the charging handle of the MG-42, mounted on the rear of his captured half-track. This weapon was the apex of infantry suppression, known to the Soviets as the bone cutter, and to the Allies as Hitler's buzzsaw. It fired 1,200 rounds per minute, 20 rounds every second. The sound wasn't a distinct staccato. It was a continuous, tearing roar, like canvas being ripped apart by a giant hand. Korolenko squeezed the trigger. The muzzle flash illuminated the dark underpass like a strobe light. A stream of green tracers lashed out, cutting through the smoke and snow. The first burst caught the lead truck, just as the infantry were jumping down. The 7.92 millimeters rounds punched through the wooden sideboards, the canvas, and the men behind them. The truck disintegrated into splinters and pink mist. The surviving infantry scrambled for the ditches, diving behind the wheels of the rear trucks. They returned fire, the snap-crack of Mauser rifles, and the pop of MP-40s echoing off the tunnel walls. Bullets sparked off the armored shield of Korolenko's machine gun, singing past his helmet. He didn't flinch. He walked the fire back and forth, suppressing the entire road. He wasn't aiming at individual soldiers anymore. He was denying them the very air they needed to move. He shifted his aim to the second truck's engine block. The armor-piercing rounds cracked the cylinder head and ignited the fuel lines. A fireball engulfed the cab, adding its light to the inferno. The heat in the tunnel was rising, melting the ice on the walls, creating a hellscape of fire and water. But the MG-42 had a weakness. It ate ammunition faster than a man could think. The belt snapped empty. The tearing sound stopped abruptly, replaced by the screams of the wounded and the shouting of German officers rallying their men. Vorwärts! Ist allein! Forward! He is alone. They had realized the fire was coming from a single point. Korolenko dropped below the armor line, grabbing a fresh metal ammo drum. His hands were slippery with oil and sweat. He flipped the feed cover open, ripped the old belt out, and slammed the new one in. It took 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, a German squad had advanced 20 meters, moving tactically through the drainage ditch on the right. He popped back up, racking the bolt. The barrel was smoking, radiating heat waves that distorted his sight picture. If he fired another long burst, the barrel would warp and the gun would jam. He had to fire in short, disciplined bursts. Burt. 2 seconds of fire, 1 second of cooling. He targeted the squad in the ditch. The water and mud erupted around them. They were pinned. But then, a new sound cut through the chaos. A whoosh followed by a sharp crack. A Panzerfaust round hit the front of Korolenko's half-track. The shape charge didn't penetrate the engine compartment fully, but the concussion was massive. The vehicle rocked violently. Metal shrapnel sprayed the interior. Korolenko was thrown against the side of the hull, his ears ringing, blood trickling from his nose. The machine gun was twisted on its mount. His primary weapon was dead, and 50 angry Germans were coming for him. The Panzerfaust impact had cracked Korolenko's ribs and ruptured his left eardrum. The world was a muffled, high-pitched whine. He rolled out of the half-track's rear hatch, landing in the slush just as the German squad unleashed a fusillade of bullets into the driver's compartment. They were killing a ghost. Korolenko was already moving, dragging his body into the deep shadows of a maintenance alcove set into the tunnel wall. He gasped for air, tasting copper and cordite. He checked his weapons. The MP-40 was lost in the wreckage. The Walther P-38 pistol had 3 rounds left, and he had his shovel. The blade was notched and dull from bone and steel, but it was still in his hand. 50 meters away, the German platoon leader, a Hauptmann screaming orders, rallied his men. They believed they had killed the Soviet blocking force. They began to climb over the burning debris of the trucks and the Stug, silhouetted against the orange inferno like demons rising from hell. They were bunched up, confident, eager to exit the tunnel and deploy. Korolenko looked at the ceiling of the tunnel. It was old brickwork, weakened by the battle. Then he looked at the crate of teller mines he had dragged out of the half-track earlier. He had used 3. There was 1 left. He hadn't placed it. It was sitting in the slush next to him. He didn't have a detonator. He didn't have a fuse. But he had a pistol and a heavy anti-tank mine. The physics were theoretical, but desperation made them practical. If he could detonate that mine while the main body of the German infantry was passing the alcove, the overpressure in the confined space would be catastrophic. He waited. The boots grew louder. German voices echoed, distorted and angry. "Sicher den Bereich. Secure the area." The point man walked past the alcove, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead, missing the figure pressed into the brickwork. Then came the main group. 10 men. 20. They were struggling with equipment, cursing the smoke. Korolenko raised the P-38. He didn't aim at the soldiers. He aimed at the center of the teller mine plate, which he had propped up against the wall, facing the crowd. It was a shaped charge directed outward, a claymore mine the size of a dinner plate. He took a breath, ignoring the pain in his ribs. He squeezed the trigger. The pistol cracked. The bullet struck the detonator cap of the mine. The explosion was not a sound. It was a physical event. The blast wave, confined by the tunnel walls, amplified instantly. It tore through the column of German infantry with the force of a freight train. Bodies were thrown like rag dolls against the ceiling. The overpressure ruptured lungs and shattered bones. The fireball consumed the oxygen in the tunnel, instantly extinguishing the smaller fires before reigniting them with a roar. Korolenko, shielded by the depth of the alcove, was still slammed against the stone by the concussion. Darkness took him. When he opened his eyes, the tunnel was silent. No screaming, no orders. Just the crackle of flames and the dripping of water. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't obey. He crawled out of the alcove. The devastation was absolute. He had stopped the advance, but he could hear one final sound, the clanking of tracks from the north. A Tiger tank. The boss was coming. The Tiger I was the apex predator of 1,943. 56 tons of hardened steel armed with the dreaded 88mm KWK-36 gun. It ground to a halt just 10 meters from the tunnel entrance, its wide tracks crushing the frozen mud. The commander, peering through his cupola, saw the wall of fire and wreckage blocking his path. The supply trucks were gone. The infantry platoon was gone. The route to the Red October factory was sealed. Ivan Korolenko stood in the shadows of the tunnel mouth. He was bleeding from his ears and nose, his uniform shredded, his body pushed beyond the limits of human endurance. He watched the Tiger's turret slowly traverse toward him. The electric motor whined as the massive muzzle brake of the 88mm gun aligned with his chest. He didn't run. He couldn't run. He gripped the handle of his MPL-50 shovel, his knuckles white. It was a ridiculous gesture, a man with a digging tool facing a machine that could kill a battleship, but it was an act of supreme defiance. But the Tiger never fired. At 0658, a high-pitched screaming sound tore through the sky above Stalingrad. It was the sound every German soldier feared more than death itself. Katyushas, Stalin's organs. The delay caused by Korolenko's one-man war in the tunnel had bunched up the German armored column on the open road behind the Tiger. Soviet forward observers had finally triangulated their position. The earth erupted. Hundreds of 132mm rockets slammed into the German rearguard. The barrage was apocalyptic. The Tiger tank, realizing it was now the tip of a broken spear, threw its transmission into reverse. The commander wasn't interested in killing one lone Russian anymore. He was interested in surviving the steel rain falling from the clouds. The monster backed away, retreating into the smoke. At 0730, the silence returned. A reconnaissance squad from the Soviet 13th Guards Rifle Division advanced cautiously toward the railway underpass. They expected to find a German breakthrough. Instead, they found a graveyard. They found the burning hulk of a Stooge 3. They found the disintegrated remains of 3 trucks. They found over 50 German dead, some killed by mines, some by machine gun fire, and some by something else. The injuries were brutal, consistent with close-quarters trauma that no bullet could cause. They found Ivan Korolenko sitting against the tunnel wall. He was unconscious, half-frozen, covered in soot. In his right hand, locked in a rigor mortis grip, was his MPL-50 entrenching tool. The blade was chipped, bent, and stained dark red. Korolenko survived the war. He was awarded the Order of the Red Banner and the Medal for the Defense of Stalingrad. But the official report was sanitized. It mentioned heroic use of captured weapons and tactical ingenuity. It didn't mention the shovel. The Soviet propaganda machine preferred stories of snipers with rifles, not desperate men with digging tools. But the soldiers knew. The story of the shovel sniper passed from foxhole to foxhole, from the ruins of Stalingrad to the streets of Berlin. It became a grim warning to any German soldier who thought a disarmed Russian was an easy kill. Ivan Korolenko never spoke much about that morning in January 1943. He returned to Siberia after the victory, working as a carpenter until his death in 1982. But it was said that he never touched a shovel again. For him, it wasn't a tool for building. It was a weapon of war. And on that frozen morning, it had been enough to stop an army.